Tanse, I'm Kristin Achkate. Welcome to APTN National News. Thank you for joining us. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has said controversial Vancouver Island candidate Aaron Gunn will remain in the race despite his resurfaced residential school comments. In videos and comments posted to social media, Aaron Gunn has said some Indigenous bands asked for residential schools and suggested what happened there should not be called genocide. That has prompted numerous First Nations groups and municipal politicians to call for his removal in the election. But speaking in Osoyoos, British Columbia on Saturday, Poilievre said Gunn will remain the Conservative candidate in the North Island Powell River riding.
The letter is false. He has not denied the impact of residential schools. That's just misinformation. In fact, he has said that he wants to continue to condemn the residential schools and build stronger partnerships with First Nations people to unlock our resources.
Parties had till 2 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday to remove candidates from their slates. After that, the selections are locked in. With 20 days left in the federal election campaign, the deadline for candidates to run has come and gone, with a roundup of Indigenous candidates hoping to get a seat in Canada's 45th Parliament. Here's APTN's Tiara Wheatley.
Data collected by APTN focuses on 4 parties. The data compiled from multiple sources, including the hashtag IndigiPoly. Come April 28th, there will be 34 Indigenous candidates on the ballot. 12 are with the Liberal Party, 6 are with the Conservatives, 13 are running with the NDP, the Green Party has 2, and the Bloc Québécois has 1. Now let's break those numbers down a bit more into First Nation, Métis, and Inuit specific. There are 22 First Nation candidates. 8 of them are Liberals, 5 are with the Conservatives, 7 are with the NDP. The Bloc and the Greens have 1 First Nation candidate each. There are 10 Métis candidates running in this election. 3 are Liberals, 5 are NDP, and the Conservatives and the Green Party have 1 Métis candidate each, and the remaining 2 candidates are Inuit. Both the Liberals and NDP have 1 Inuk candidate each. Of the 34, there are 7 incumbents, 4 of which are names we've heard in the media a lot. Jaime Baptiste for Cape Breton Antigonish. He threw his name in to replace Justin Trudeau as Liberal Party leader earlier this year, then backed out. And 3 NDPers, Leah Gazan from Winnipeg Centre and Lori Idlu of Nunavut, both often speaking out against violence on Indigenous women and girls, as well as Blake Desjardins of Edmonton Griesbeck riding. He is a Cree Métis who is Two-Spirit and is often vocal on the subject matter. There are also a handful of First Nations candidates who've held leadership positions in their own communities or regions. Both Tanya Cameron and Charles Fox are candidates in the Kenora-Kiiwetinoong riding in Northern Ontario, and Rebecca Chartrand is hopeful for the Churchill-Kiiwetinoong-Aski riding seat in Northern Manitoba. Those ridings are 2 of 36 that the Assembly of First Nations says are swing ridings where First Nations voters could determine who gets in. 2 other notable First Nation candidates are Gilbert Whiteduck in Pontiac-Kitigan-Zibi and Billy Morin in Edmonton Northwest. Both were chiefs in their home communities. For a full list of the Indigenous candidates' names and their ridings, go to aptnnews.ca. And in the next 2 weeks, APTN will also profile some of those AFN-identified swing ridings with coverage of issues more specific to those regions. Tiara Wheatley, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Thanks, TR. We now want to tell you about this week's new web poll question. Over on our website, we ask, do you think young people who are old enough to vote actually care about politics? Your answers are yes, no, or unsure. Have your say by going to aptnnews.ca. The poll section is on the right-hand side of the homepage. A teenager in the Kwakatoos First Nation in Saskatchewan has been seriously injured after being struck by an RCMP vehicle. On Tuesday at around 10 p.m., an RCMP member from the Punashai detachment was traveling to the Kwakatoos First Nation responding to a firearms-related incident. RCMP say the officer was driving on the Kandahar Grid Road less than a kilometer from Kwakatoos when the officer struck a pedestrian on the road. A 16-year-old boy was seriously injured. The officer called EMS and began first aid on the boy, who was later airlifted to the Regina General Hospital and then transferred to Saskatoon for treatment. Saskatchewan's Serious Incident Response Team is now investigating the incident. Kwakatoos is located about 130 kilometers north of Regina. A new study highlights the disparity in child and family services contact with First Nations and non-Indigenous families over a 20-year period.
1 in every 2 First Nations parents had involvement with CFS in this time period, which was almost 4 times higher among First Nations parents than non-First Nations parents.
It's among the findings of the joint study by the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the University of Manitoba. It tracked data from 1998 to 2019 for more than 13,000 First Nations and just under 107,000 non-First Nations parents. It found 27% of First Nations parents experienced the removal of 1 or more children, and 10% had their parental rights terminated, 6 times higher than non-Indigenous families. Researchers are recommending First Nations-led care systems and reunification homes. The authors also suggest full government assistance and public housing for parents with children in temporary care, preventative supports, and holistic wellness for at-risk parents.
Our nations, we have the solutions. We just need the support to ensure that we have capacity and the infrastructure to make sure that our children and families are supported in community.
Manitoba's Families Minister says the report is a reflection of historical child welfare in Manitoba. She says the system was predictated on Indigenous families being labeled as unable to care for children.
My number one focus is to decolonize child welfare. My number one focus is to ensure that children are with their families, in their communities, immersed in their language and their culture and their traditions.
Nahani Fontaine says the province is working to keep families together by transferring power to Indigenous child and family service agencies and encouraging placing children with their own families for care. After years of inaction from the province of British Columbia, the Sewali First Nation recently gathered with community members to clean up a problematic homeless encampment that sits at the entrance of the First Nation near the Chilliwack River. About 75 people came together to help clear out this encampment, which they say has been around for years. Sewali leadership says the encampment caused serious harm with illicit drug activity, mounds of garbage, used syringes, open fires, contaminated water, and unsafe interactions with the community. The band says years of trying to address their concerns with the provincial government went nowhere, so they acted alone to exercise their inherent rights. No one was at the camp when the cleanup began. The Sewali First Nation is located just south of Chilliwack.
The bigger picture is that there are mental health issues, drug addiction problems, and the cost of living has everyone afraid that they're just one paycheck away from this as well. Now I ask all of you, who has the ability to make those changes? Sewali has sat at many tables and brought up our issues with this encampment. We've talked about the fear some of our members have been going through with this area.
Climate activists, scientists, and Indigenous leaders have united in BC to send a dire warning about the environment. That story when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. A climate action event is currently underway in Vancouver this week, where scientists and experts are sharing their knowledge about what's happening around the globe with the changing weather and climate. APTN's Tina House was there and brings us this story.
For years, scientists have been raising the alarm over what they say is a climate emergency. From the rapid melting of the ice in Greenland due to warmer ocean temperatures, the result is rising sea levels estimated to be as high as 7 meters all over the world.
Where these glaciers extend out into the ocean, warmer ocean temperatures are melting them up to 100 times faster under the surface than above. Temperature rise and melting in the interior causes the ice sheet to lose more ice than it gains each year. In turn, the equilibrium line is retreating further inland, while the glaciers are sliding further toward the coast and into the warming oceans. The question is, how fast?
Scientists also say if we don't do anything to stop the carbon pollution into the atmosphere, we can expect more extreme wildfires due to drought in some areas. Flooding will happen in other areas, and extreme heat and cold temperatures are expected more frequently. At this climate action event in Vancouver, over 100 people from the scientific community, Indigenous leaders, and community members gathered to hear about what's the latest predictions when it comes to global warming and how it affects every living thing on the Earth. The keynote speaker is Dr. David Suzuki. He says massive extinction events of species is already happening at an alarming rate.
Another 1 million species are on the brink of extinction. Earth has entered a 6th period of mass extinction, and we know the cause, which is us. We are the only species with the intelligence to foresee our demise as a species. The tragedy is that we now know we are threatening our own survival, and we know how to avoid the current threat, but are unable to take the steps.
The event was organized by the First Nations Summit, an Indigenous political organization. Hugh Breaker is an executive member of the summit, and he says it's crucial for everyone to prepare for emergencies that seem to be getting more and more frequent.
I want to say to all Indigenous people on the coast of British Columbia or in an area that's affected by the ocean, my last comment, which is you can't wait to prepare. You have to prepare now. You should be getting ready now for the effects of sea level rise. If it really does melt within the next century, it's going to go up 7 meters. And it's accelerating. The melt is accelerating.
Dr. Suzuki believes the way forward is to look to the past.
We need that guidance and the value system of Indigenous people who've lived in place for thousands of years. That's what we need to learn. So it's an exciting moment, but it's very, very late. And the thing that my job is, I mean, Indigenous people are fine, they're on the rise, but I'm now saying, why is it we don't take science seriously? I did my first television programs in 1962. And, the thing I was saying then is science affects every aspect of your life. You got to take it seriously.
Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Now a story for all of the Game of Thrones fans out there. Scientists say they've genetically engineered 3 wolves that may resemble the extinct dire wolves, according to the company trying to bring back the lost species.
We've taken a gray wolf genome, a gray wolf cell, which is already genetically 99.5% identical to dire wolves, and we've edited those cells.
The wolf pups are between 3 to 6 months old and sport long white hair and muscular jaws. They already weigh around 80 pounds and are expected to reach 140 pounds. Dire wolves went extinct more than 10,000 years ago and are much larger than gray wolves, their closest living relatives. Independent scientists say for now, all science can do is make something look like something else, not fully revive extinct species, and it's unlikely we will see dire wolves roaming North American grasslands anytime soon. Coming up next, we have an expert to talk about why there is not enough Indigenous candidates running in this year's federal election. We'll be right back. Starting on the east, Charlottetown 1, Halifax sunny and 0. Cartwright -3, La Grande River -11. Saint-Jovite -3, Quebec City -4 and partly cloudy. Sunny in Ottawa at -2, Peterborough 0. Sudbury -4, Thunder Bay 1. Puckatawagan 1, Thompson 1. Winnipeg 1, Gimli 0. Partly cloudy in Regina at 4, Saskatoon 4. 3 in Stony Rapids, La Ronge, sun's out there as well, and +2. Rain in Peace River at 15, Fort McMurray 15 as well. 16 in Medicine Hat, Calgary 16. 14 in Penticton, Vancouver, rain in 13. Rain in Fort Nelson at 11, Smithers 10. 5 in Whitehorse, Mayo 7. Fort Simpson 13, Yellowknife 4. -2 in Sax Harbor, Polituck 6. -5 in Baker Lake, Chesterfield -5. And Arctic Bay -8, Aglulik -8. Thanks for staying with us. The 45th federal election is just around the corner, and with that, over 1,800 candidates Canada-wide have put their names forward in hopes of becoming their riding's next MP. But in places like the Yukon, no Indigenous candidates are running. Here to talk about that is Ken Coates, Professor Emeritus for the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan and Distinguished Fellow and Director of Indigenous Affairs at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Professor Ken Coates, thanks so much for joining us today. No Indigenous candidates in the Yukon are running in the federal election. In fact, there are no Indigenous people known to have run for a federal election in the territory since 2015. What are your thoughts as to why that is?
So it's always interesting because in one sense it's kind of unfortunate. We want to have Indigenous folks who have access to the whole political process, who participate in national politics. But think about it in a different way. The Yukon has one of the most intensely participatory democracy units in the world, because you have Aboriginal self-government in so many of the First Nations in the Yukon. If you don't, you have a band council. You have very active Indigenous participation in the Yukon territorial election. You've had city councillors in Whitehurst and certainly in the smaller communities. So if you look at it in a different way, you would say, good heavens, Indigenous people, First Nations people are really heavily involved in Yukon politics generally. And the second reason is a little bit less pleasant, I guess, is that 75% of the Yukon's population is non-Aboriginal. And so if you're trying to run for federal office, you want to make sure you reach that demographic as well. And that's meant it's really tended to be sort of fairly prominent professional people from Whitehorse tend to be the ones who sort of stand for public office. And it is it's not a terrible surprise given demographics and political realities.
Yes, for sure. And the lack of Indigenous candidates isn't just limited to the Yukon. There's other ridings across Canada that also don't have Indigenous candidates. Can you speak about some other ridings where this applies as well? And why aren't Indigenous people running there? You talked about it a bit.
So across Canada, you see a similar process where most parts, northern Alberta, northern British Columbia, you have a large number of Indigenous people, but an even way larger number of non-Indigenous people. And so, in fact, you had a larger pool to draw from and more natural support, et cetera, et cetera. And given the fact that there's, in many quarters, still some reluctance to sort of see Indigenous people as sort of federal leaders in that regard. But let me give you a good example, because there are good examples. They exist in places like James Bay, northern Ontario, where you start to get people coming in those areas, northern Quebec, Nunavut, et cetera, et cetera. Those are Indigenous dominated jurisdictions. But what's interesting is what they've done in the province of Saskatchewan, because for a long time, northern Saskatchewan was sort of one riding, two ridings actually, but they had the Indigenous people in the far north, and then right along the southern border, there were a whole bunch of communities of 3,000 to 5,000 people. And so the northern part would vote overwhelmingly for an Indigenous candidate, the southern part would vote overwhelmingly for a non-Indigenous candidate, and the non-Indigenous candidate would win. So what they've done now is they've stripped out the non-Indigenous communities. Northern Saskatchewan now covers the whole, what's called the Northern Administration Branch. The population is about 75 to 80% First Nations and Métis. It's going to be dominated by, I think, all the candidates this time around. Most of them will be Indigenous people, and the leading candidate is almost certain to win is a Liberal running for the from a Métis person from Île-à-la-Crosse. So in other words, when you look at this systematically and actually try to create political boundaries that actually reflect Indigenous and non-Indigenous realities, you can get what I would call a preferred result. Northern Saskatchewan should be represented, if at all possible, by an Indigenous person who has deep roots in the communities. That's what you'd like to see. And the people before were deeply rooted in their communities, but they were further south on the agricultural belt. And so they had different priorities and different values and different approaches. So I think we are getting a situation where province by province, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, people are paying more attention to that kind of situation. In the Yukon, you have one member of parliament. You have Whitehurst with whatever it is, 80% of the population. You have 75% of the people in the Yukon being non-Aboriginal. That's what you're likely to get in the Yukon. You'll eventually get an Indigenous candidate, but it'll probably be for a party that doesn't have much of a chance to win. That's what happens in British Columbia all the time, happens in Alberta and southern areas, is they sort of have Indigenous, they pad the list of candidates with Indigenous people to give them some experience. That's a good way of looking at it. To bring Indigenous perspectives to the party platform and the party campaigns, that's a good way to look at it. But also it's sort of kind of value virtue signaling. Hey, we have 5 Indigenous candidates, not one of them has a good chance. So I don't like that last one. So we're still a ways away. But the other thing I would say really quickly is that, for Indigenous people, the question is where's the most important role of government? And I'll just use a good example in the case of the last government, when the Liberals were in as they are now in power. Jody Wilson-Raybould came in as an extremely powerful and influential cabinet minister, Minister of Justice. She was treated abysmally by the Prime Minister and by some of her colleagues. She had two colleagues who resigned in protest over her mistreatment. And that sent a really important signal. And the signal was, you can come and become a federal politician, but you better behave, and you better do what we tell you to do. And if you know Jody Wilson-Raybould, you know that's the worst thing in the world you could say to her or to any other Indigenous person. So, just having an Indigenous face doesn't mean you necessarily get the kind of results you want.
Ken Coates, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're more than welcome.
And that's your daytime newscast for this Wednesday, April 9th. We're back again in a few hours for your evening newscast with more news stories. Please join us then. From our reporting staff across the country and from our HQ here in Winnipeg, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again. Exet.